Now it's started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for bearing with us for a couple of minutes, and welcome to the Triple D webinar series session 2, debunking data, indicators and methods. I'm Nando Lewis. I'm part of the DTM team in London. My work focuses on the interactions of conflict and climate change, environment, and displacement and migration. So this second session of the Triple D, so Data, Disasters and Displacement webinar series, is organized by the platform on disaster displacement. And this session, organized by DTM, will be focused on debunking data, indicators and methods with the aim of identifying key challenges in defining environmental migrants from a methodological point of view. Understanding data collection methodologies used to capture people displaced by disasters, as well as exploring useful indicators which could help in identifying populations who are more vulnerable in the context of disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. Just quickly to go over the virtual meeting rules. I think some of these may not apply because of the different permissions that fancy Zoom technology allows us to implement. But specifically, if you would like to ask questions, please write them in the chat, and they will be raised at the end of the discussion. We should have a healthy amount of time for questions and answers. So please, when you do have any questions, drop them in the chat, and we can raise them from there. If you would like to make interventions, also drop it in the chat, and we can change the permissions to allow you to speak as well. So more and more we're listening to figures about the number of people who are or who will be displaced by climate change. For example, IDMC reported that more than 23 million new displacements linked to natural hazards were recorded in 2021. The World Bank estimates that without timely and substantial climate and development action, by 2050, up to 216 million people could be forced to move within their own countries due to slow onset climate change impacts. These are only a few of the numbers we increasingly hear talked about. But when we're speaking about the impact of climate change and human mobility, but how are these data collected? What are the methods and models used to estimate the number of people displaced and moving in the context of sudden onset events such as earthquakes, extreme weather events such as tropical cyclones, and slow onset events related to the adverse effects of climate change, such as sea level rise or desertification? To help disentangle these questions, we have organized a panel discussion with Ingrid Boas, Associate Professor at the Environmental Policy Group, Wageningen University, Alex de Scherbinin, Associate Director for Science Applications and Senior Research Scientist at CIESIN, Columbia University, Ivana Hajmanova, Regional Coordinator for MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, and Diogo Andreola Seraglio, Global Focal Point at the South American Network for Environmental Migrations. However, before diving into these discussions and allowing our panelists to introduce themselves further, we thought some initial remarks might be helpful, particularly on, sorry, I should have put this up earlier so you can see people's names. Initial remarks on definitions and our definitions of an environmental migrant, and defining who falls within the boundaries of this term environmental migrant may be challenging, and a multiplicity of factors influencing or forcing a person to move hinder the understanding of who is actually moving due to the impact of climate change, especially in contexts of slow onset environmental degradation. Now we'll go to our discussion, and I'd like to welcome Atle to introduce and begin this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nando. Can you confirm that you hear me well?
Yes,
good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. My name is Atle Solberg. I'm head of the Secretariat of the Platform on disaster displacement. And we are a state-led initiative and currently under the leadership of Fiji. So I've been invited to say a few opening welcoming remarks. So I will ask more questions than giving answers. I think we have a very capable panel to help us out on some of the questions or the challenges we are facing when it comes to data and understanding disaster displacement. I'm very pleased to be part of the second session on debunking data, indicators, and methods, which is part of a triple D webinar series on data, disaster, and displacement. I want to, in particular, thank the International Organization for Migration and Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre that co-chair the Data Knowledge Working Group under the advisory committee of the platform on disaster displacement. These kind of events are very important and also to bring together a range of researchers, practitioners, and also policymakers that all need to work together to address some of the data challenges. You may recall, many of you, hopefully, that the platform on disaster displacement we grew out of, or we are a successor to the Nansen initiative that was launched in 2012, and which culminated with what we refer to as the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, endorsed by 110 states in October 2015. And the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda identified data and evidence as a key gap to work on and as a priority area for future action. One of those areas which has influenced many of the priorities of the platform is collecting data and enhancing knowledge on disaster displacement. Since the PDD has been launched, the strategic priority of strengthening evidence and data has been a priority for the PDD, and it remains so. So for us to have a data knowledge working group co-chaired by IOM and IDMC as part of our advisory committee is a privilege as an asset as we try to strengthen our understanding. Nando, you somehow stole some of my points which I wanted to make. And one is that last year we heard from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre in the global report on internal displacement that there were 23.7 persons displaced internally in the consequence of sudden onset events, most of them weather related. And I think one question we should ask ourselves is what does that number really mean, and who's included and not included in that important number. And I'm sure that Ivana will also help us to unpack that a little, because I think it's important to be honest about the limitation also of that number or that matrix. It clearly says limited about those moving or compelled to move in the context of slow onset events and processes. It says very little about solutions. We know it's a flow data matrix. It's not saying much about stock. We know very little about what happened to people displaced among those 23.7 million last year. For example, many are counted as displaced when they're evacuated. Maybe the protection needs are limited, whereas others may face more challenges. And it's of course hard to square the idea of 23.7 million people displaced in the context of disaster when we know that any movement is multi-causal. So how do we account for other factors that may put people at risk of being displaced? I think an equally important question we should ask ourselves is what kind of data or metrics is important for us? What do we need to do better risk mitigation or averting or minimizing displacement? What do we need in order to have sound adaptation policies, sound risk reduction policies that will help us to avert or minimize displacement? What do we need to know when we need to address displacement after the fact? So these are some of the challenges I think we all face, and I'm very confident that this panel today will also help us to move on to have a better understanding. Where are our limitations and where do we need to invest our efforts as we go forward. I would also recognizing the strides that have been made, both by the IDMC and also colleagues on this panel when it comes to data and disaster displacement the last 10, 15 years, and maybe have some observation around what are now the key gaps and where do we invest, where do we need to invest as we move forward. The risk landscape will not be less complicated. It will not be less challenging if we are not able to combat climate change. So this is an important issue that we unfortunately will have to struggle with and address in the years to come. So with that, thank you so much for inviting me to some introductory remarks. I look very much forward to this great panel, and then to be with you towards the end and to see also where we can take this issue further. Thank you so much, Nando.
Thank you, Atle. Before we move on to the questions, would any of the panelists like to immediately address any of Atle's comments? Yes, Ivana, please.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, Nando, and thank you, Atle, for bringing up the findings of our recent global report on internal displacement. So just to quickly respond to some of the questions you raised regarding the data, especially the limitations and what the data actually includes. So as you mentioned, the figure of new displacements due to disasters in 2021 stood at 23.7 million. And indeed, it includes mostly sudden onset disasters, but around 250,000 of new displacements in this figure is related to drought. So despite that, there is a small proportion of this figure which actually refers to slow onset disasters. But again, it's very much dependent on the data which we receive at IDMC. So it refers to mostly countries in the Horn of Africa which have systems for monitoring slow onset disasters such as drought. But a large majority of the figure refers to sudden onset disasters. And as you said, there are a few other limitations. I would say one of the biggest ones is the fact that we still face issues capturing all short-term displacements. As you can imagine, it's quite hard to be able to capture every movement, and in some cases, it might take just 1 or 2 days for people to be displaced and then they return home. And we don't always have monitoring systems in place to capture all these movements. So we think that this figure is actually quite a big underestimate in reality. At the same time, it's quite difficult to also account for all the different types of evacuations, especially when evacuation orders are in place, but not always all the people comply with these orders. So again, we have to rely on different proxies and estimates to actually estimate the number of people who were displaced as a result of evacuations. And also, as you rightly mentioned, the third important limitation would be to capture correctly displacement as a result of kind of several different events. And as you can see in our report, we have there a different disaggregation of disaster events. So you can see how many new displacements occurred as a result of cyclones, storms, floods, landslides, and so on. But in many cases, it's just difficult to assign this one trigger because you can have one cyclone which displaces people, but then there's follow-up flooding, and then there is follow-up landslide. And then it's hard sort of to know how to qualify these movements, whether as a result of landslide or as a result of the cyclone, which actually caused the landslide. And very last point to react to these great opening remarks, it's regarding the total number of people who live in displacement as the end of the year, because the report also shows this figure. As of the end of 2021, we estimated that 5.9 million people were living in displacement as a result of disasters. But again, we consider this figure as a big underestimate, just because in most countries we lack data. And there is an overall lack of follow-up after the emergency phase of a disaster. But still, it represents some partial estimate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. And I think your penultimate point really brings us nicely to the first set of questions on focusing on how do we go into these definitions and this multi-causality of displacement. So Ivana, if you could please unmute yourself. And then we'll So the question to the panelists is, how do we create tools and methodologies that are able to consider multi-causality and complexity? Is it useful to combine data coming from different sources, climate data, population distribution data, etc.? And what is the right approach to combine and compare data produced using different methodologies and criteria? Ingrid, go ahead, or Ingrid, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was thinking, so first I said I had no slide, but maybe it's actually relevant to show one slide or to just contextualize what I tried to say. Is that I think generally, I think it's good that the field is increasingly looking into sort of different sets of data in order to get a better sense of what's going on. I myself come somewhat more from the qualitative approaches and sort of case study approaches. And I think those are also still very relevant to connect to sort of large data sets and to see what's going on. And just to, I thought I can try to share my screen to show why I think that's useful. Share. You see this, right?
Yes, we see it.
Yeah. So here, I think this was a big data analysis done some time back from Lou, David Rattle, and other people who used mobile phone data to look into how people moved following a big disaster, like a cyclone that hit the south of Bangladesh. So it was here, basically, in the south of Bangladesh, and that they had this mobile phone tower data to look into the mobilities there. And sort of when you see this image, I personally, but also David Rattle, we sort of hypothesized, oh, this is likely late evacuation, some form of displacement. And then we decided that I would go to one of these areas to find out sort of what was going on there, to find out more in detail how this displacement looked like. But then when I was there, I then found out, people didn't seem to have been moving to the cyclone shelters. The water also didn't enter the area, but it turned out to be fishers who were moving back and forth on the land to go to the harbor areas to protect their boats. It was rather sort of existing sort of livelihood practice that was there already for a long time, and it's there with every storm, and there was a lot of communication, mobile phone communication about it. So sort of these are these sort of harbor areas that were there. And then it turned also later we focused on another area where there was not so much mobile phone type of data, and there it turned out actually that people were displaced, you could call it, but actually sort of trapped in a highly sort of vulnerable site where the embankment was broken and the water went in. Sort of here, there's a sort of big hole in the embankment, so very easily the water flows into the land because a lot of erosion, etc., had taken place. So I think just to stop sharing that, I think the experience shows that we have some biases. Also, I myself, sort of when we see particular patterns, we, at least as researchers, we sort of thought, oh, it's probably evacuation or probably some sort of form of displacement, and it turned out not to be. These mobility patterns turned out to be rather some form of livelihood adaptation type of strategies. And where there was no data, actually, there is actually where most of the help and attention was sort of needed. So I think this connecting of different sort of data sets and to ground also what you see, I think that's quite vital to avoid that we too quickly over assume when we see something. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I think that comment also complements what Ivana was saying earlier about these short-term movements. Alex, I'll hand over to you as you had your hand up next.
Thanks, Diogo, and thanks for having me on this panel. My work centers on a range of data typically not the kind of microdata and community level analysis that Ingrid is involved in, and I agree with her 100%. You need to ground the research ultimately in sort of lived experiences, and if you're going to explain why people are moving, you actually need to ask people why they moved and understand that from a ground level. You know, there's kind of a common discourse, and I've been on the data and knowledge working group for a number of years. And the line is that, well, we don't have really all the information we need, and we need more data. And I actually am questioning that to some degree. I think there's been, you know, some recent publications on the topics around climate mobility, which I'm a little bit more directly involved in terms of my own research and writing, not as much on, you know, immediate displacement related to climate or environmental events, but the writing that is in the climate mobilities literature suggests that actually trying to pinpoint the precise attribution and, you know, the degree to which climate variables are actually affecting people's movements may be somewhat missing the point. And so just to be a little provocative, I think that we may have, you know, among the different data streams that we have, and I'll mention a couple in a moment, we may have enough evidence to show that there are a lot of people moving for both, you know, short-term displacement and the kinds of things we're seeing increasingly in the Caribbean with, you know, massive storms coming in and really devastating entire islands. And so people moving temporarily to other islands and sometimes staying there permanently, and other events that Ivana described so eloquently, where, you know, figuring out the precise attribution is not that difficult because we know there was a major event and people are leaving for those reasons. But then the longer and the slow onset events, you know, that becomes increasingly difficult. And so this kind of messy middle between the people who move voluntarily and for labor-related reasons and over longer term periods, and those who are classified either as displaced or refugees, I think is going to make up an increasing fraction of the people who are on the move globally. And figuring out what to do about that messy middle is actually a real challenge. And the data sets we have at our disposal basically rely on either long-term, you know, investments that the society has made in censuses and surveys, or these more novel data and technologies such as Facebook's or Meta now has data that they're hopefully soon to release on, you know, movements both internally and internationally of people who move from their usual location to some other location for more than 6 months. We've been playing with data related to cell phone, in particularly, not the actual call detail records, but they're data that are collected by everyone who is essentially using mobile apps. And so there's companies that actually aggregate these data and can analyze whether people are moving or not. And there have been some interesting, there's a lot of noise in the data, and it's difficult to often disentangle the noise, the signal from the noise, but we have a lot of these new data sets. I think they're going to increasingly shed light on patterns of mobility, but I do think one of the key and crucial issues will be how do we deal with this kind of messy middle of people who are moving for a wide range of reasons, among which, and you know, you had in your definition, predominantly for environmental reasons. I think we're going to find very few people moving predominantly for environmental reasons, apart from those very short-term displacements owing to direct climate impacts or environmental stressors. How are we going to deal with a lot of those people who are kind of in the in-between? And I know we're not here to talk about policy per se, but I think data and the PDD generally is all about, you know, influencing policy. So yes, we need good data to buttress policies, but we know that a lot of people are on the move. So sorry for that somewhat rambling discourse, but I'm interested to hear what other panelists have to say about this as well. Over.
Thank you, Alex. And I'll hand straight over to Ivana.
Thank you so much, and it's so interesting to listen to Ingrid and Alex and their take on this question. And I would like to react to some of the points they raised because they are extremely relevant, especially the one on, you know, how we can actually define what is a forced movement, and then what is sort of you know, adaptive voluntary migration, because I think that's one of the key questions here, which we should be trying to address. And I think that in order to address this question, we actually need to look at many different data sets, and we also need a very solid baseline data in the first place, against which we can measure the different sort of outliers in migration trends. And what I wanted to highlight as well is the fact that when it comes to slow onset disasters, especially such as drought, for example, which is one of the disasters I analyze most often, we always need to look at these sort of thresholds or tipping points which make people move, because as we mentioned at the beginning, when it comes to slow onset disasters, they take place over a very long period of time, and sorry, I was just distracted by the comment in the chat. They take place over a very long period of time, and we need to understand at which point people decide to move. And in order to understand that, we need a lot of baseline data regarding their socio-economic status, their coping abilities, and then we can understand better at which point it will be unbearable for them to stay at a given location, and then they decide to move. So we need demographic data, we need economic data, socio-economic data, and also, of course, data related to hazards. Maybe last point on this is regarding the baseline data and how to actually distinguish between more sort of a regular migration and forced movements, I would say, or at least movements linked to some sort of outliers, which can be linked to climate change or other types of disasters. I think that there is a very good practice in West Africa, where actually IMDTM has a transhumans tool, and they collect regularly data on movements of pastoralists across West Africa. And then by collecting this data and understanding what are the directions of the pastoralists, what are the different trajectories, what is the size of the herds, which they move around, we can actually understand what sort of the regular migration, what are the regular patterns in these areas. And then we can also observe when some sort of irregular migration starts happening, when we see that much larger population flows happens in certain direction, and this can give us a better indication that actually something might be happening, and we should be paying attention to it. But if we come and we start monitoring only once we see that there might be massive influx of people into a certain location, then it might be a bit too late to start the monitoring. We need to start earlier, before a disaster, even a slow onset disaster happens, in order to have the baseline data and have something to compare it against. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana, and I'll hand straight over to Diogo.
Thank you, Nando. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to complement the information provided by the previous colleagues and on how we could combine data from different sources, I would like to bring a little bit the perspective of national governments, especially in Latin America, and how with what's in there, they are doing, if we would have chances of combining this data and coming up with information related to human mobility in the context of climate and other environmental changes. So I would like to bring some information actually from a consultancy developed for IOM's GMDEC on migration, environment, disaster and climate change data in the Eastern Caribbean states. The project covered 6 countries in the Caribbean: Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And in short, the study investigated how key national agencies in these countries are collecting, managing, and disseminating data on climate and disaster-related mobility. So by comparing the procedures established under existing agencies, we would be able to provide an overview of data availability, quality, and accessibility at the regional level. And then here I would like to bring some information that we got from the 6 statistics departments in these countries, and to see to what extent we would be able to combine the information, or to see what they are doing and how we could come out with information on the topic. So national statistics departments, these 6 countries, I need to emphasize that they generally tend to capture and serve as the main sources of socioeconomic, demographic, and environmental statistics and indicators at the national level. Among the statistics departments examined in the 6 countries, only 2 generate statistics and indicators on environmental issues. And then we check what kind of environmental or information related to climate change. We noticed that information is limited to greenhouse gases emissions. So that's the only kind of information statistics departments are able to, are collecting or working on at the moment. We also noticed that while not generating a specific statistics on environment, the other countries, they usually publish compendiums on environmental statistics, and then they use information from secondary sources of information, like disaster agencies. And then we were able to find some information, for instance, related to the human mobility dimension, but always diluted in a broader category of affected people. When we shift and we check statistics and indicators related to the human mobility dimension, we noticed that some general aspects of migration are gathered as part of the national censuses, for instance. So regarding the last census activities in these countries and their respective questionnaires, all of them present sections related to international or internal migration. And they often include questions on the reasons for moving or returning to the country. Specifically, the only one, St. Kitts and Nevis population and houses census, was the only one to present as a reason for moving back to the country. They had as an option the weather, but then it was not clear to us if they were actually addressing a disaster, for instance, or just trying to capture information on migrants that are coming to the Caribbean because of the nice weather from North America, for instance. What we also concluded from the exercise is that the climate change, disaster, and human mobility nexus has been increasingly prominent in household and other demographic or population-based service. And then I would like to highlight the relevance of conducting these kind of activities at the national level, because that would be a way to capture data on slow onset events as well. And St. Lucia in 2016 conducted a survey of living conditions and household budgets with a specific section on shocks and coping strategies. So in this exercise, they brought questions related to both sudden and slow onset events. They were trying to capture the information of migration and displacement in such contexts. And afterwards, the report was released with relevant information. Just in conclusion here, and what I think that could be important for the discussion is that the lack of specific statistics and indicators on climate change and disasters on the one hand, and insufficient statistics and indicators on the human mobility dimension on the other hand, hampers the overlapping or the combination of information, and as a result, the production of data on the topic. Also, we need to keep in mind the different time and spatial scales on existing data that usually constrain the generation of comparable data on the topic. So I hand over to you, Nando, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Diogo. Ingrid will take a short intervention from you before moving on to the next set of questions, just in the interest of the time remaining as well.
Yeah, I can also leave it for later. It was just, yeah, maybe linking up to what Alex mentioned and also what Jane says in the chat. I noticed, at least in my own research, I sometimes struggle with maybe sort of as in the type of research that I do, I may be less interested in really sort of finding exactly what the role of the climatic changes or the environmental changes have been. I rather sort of try to get, yeah, more in a way a historical or deeper social or cultural perspective to what's going on and how climate change is intersecting with that. As for instance, if you look into cases of pastoralism that have often been going on for a very long time, and their particular identities that people associate with being able to move, etc., and particular knowledge of moving, and also a particular language of talking about the environment and of the changes they see. And then there are, of course, the climatic changes and also the scientific language as to how we talk about climatic changes and other sets of data. And I sometimes also struggle myself, so I find this comment interesting to, yeah, so how to bring that together in a way. If you are in the messy reality, it's very hard to pinpoint what exactly everything is. You try to give sort of this richer sort of narrative, but probably from a policy perspective, yeah, you may be seeking for something more specific and want to identify the environmental migrant, as I think the first question later goes into. Whilst in practice, I wonder to what extent is this something we should want? And yeah, but maybe that's a lead up to later discussion.
Thank you. Yes, that's an interesting can of worms to open up. Thank you for your inputs on the first set of questions. We'll now move on to our next set, and they are: what are the main indicators and factors that can help us in identifying people vulnerable to disaster displacement? Which are the limitations in current data collection methodologies? And what are the main available tools you could use to estimate the number of people who will be displaced by disasters in the future? And for attendees, I'll also paste the question in the chat just so you can be reminded of it as well. Yes, Ivana?
Thank you so much, Nando, and very, very interesting question. So, I mean, there are 3 questions in one, right? So let me try to go one by one and answer each of them. I will try to be brief because there is a lot to say about each of them. But regarding the main indicators, we need to understand, or we need to have a data on in order to understand disaster displacement or estimate disaster displacement and how much displacement can happen in the future. I would say we need to understand first what coping mechanisms are available for the people who are at risk of displacement and how they will be able to use them in case a disaster happens. We also need to understand whether these people will be able to flee and get displaced, because as we know, there are many people who cannot flee for many different reasons. Maybe they are not physically able to flee, or they have a very strong emotional attachment to the place where they live, or they they cannot move for other reasons. They have a livestock to take care of. So we need to understand these things as well. We also need to see, for example, when it comes to slow onset disasters, especially if these people have any alternative livelihood options available for them. So, for example, if a drought destroys all their crops, will they be able to refocus on a different type of livelihood, or will this mean that they have no other option and they will have to move somewhere else in order to survive? We should be also able to understand whether these people are at risk of multiple shocks. So, is it only drought or is it only flood what they are at risk of? Or are there other shocks which are sort of impacting on their ability to cope and on their vulnerability? So we should also get information on this, and then this could help us assess the risk at which they are to get displaced. Maybe two more things to highlight on that. We should be also able to understand the governance in the area of origin in these people, and how local authorities will be able to respond to a disaster or even prevent a potential disaster. And this will give us an indication of how many people can get displaced. And the last thing to highlight as an important indicator would be also the social support networks. And to understand whether these people have a social support network in their areas of origin, and this network will be able to support them and provide any sort of help in case they are at risk of displacement, or whether these social support networks are rather somewhere far away, because we might be talking about different ethnic groups and so on, and the ethnic group of this particular family or person might be far away, and maybe if they're at risk of displacement, they will prefer to move to this area where their ethnic group is present to seek some social support. So I think that would be a few, at least, indicators to highlight, to keep an eye on. But of course, there are many more. And now, the second part of your question, which focused more on the limitations of the current data methodologies. So I mentioned some when it comes to the sudden onset disasters at the very beginning. So let me focus more on slow onset now, because I think that's actually the more challenging data collection. I would say one of the biggest challenges is really the lack of analytical depth in a lot of the data sets, because a lot of the data sets we are currently using to assess slow onset displacement, displacement related with slow onset disasters, are actually data sets and data methodologies used for sudden onset disasters. And we have very different needs and very different data needs when it comes to these different types of disasters. And when it comes to slow onset disasters, we need more information on sex and age disaggregated data. We need to understand better pre-existing vulnerabilities of these people, their social status, their livelihoods, and so on. And in many cases, we don't have this information in the data sets. And this lack of information means that we cannot understand very well why these people are moving, where they will go, and at which point they will actually move, because they will reach this tipping point, which I mentioned at the beginning. The other issue is the problem that we lack baseline data. So something I mentioned in my previous intervention, so I will not go into depth on that. But basically, we don't have baseline data against which we could compare the current trends and the current migration trends, and therefore it remains very difficult to understand what is an outlier and what is actually a regular migration. And maybe the last thing I would highlight on the limitations is that the current data collection is also very rigid in a way. In most of the data sets I work with, we can select just one reason for displacement. But as we mentioned at the beginning, when it comes to slow onset disasters, actually there are multiple reasons for displacement, and usually people face a lot of different kind of shocks before they decide to move. And for example, when I worked with communities in Somalia, there we could really see the multi-causality of displacement when people face high taxes imposed by the militant group Al-Shabaab on them. Then they lose part of their herds because of drought, other part because of flood, and then at some point they decide to move. And then when the data is collected, they can indicate just one reason of displacement. But what do you pick? Do you pick conflict or drought or disaster or something else? But then for data collection, we can just pick one. So I think that's also another issue, that's just that the data collection and the methodologies are just so rigid. I will just leave it at that and leave space to other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana, and taking us back round again to the messy middle that Alex and other colleagues were talking about as well. I'll hand over now to Alex.
Yeah, well, picking up a little bit on where Ivana left off, I'm going to try to address the first two questions in your series, but I'll start with the second one. And Jane Lineker's comment about, well, how do we do data collection in that messy middle? I actually think the kinds of data collection, that Jane does at the Mixed Migration Center and that others have done through, like Ingrid, on the ground, asking people, understanding motivations, the complexity of local situations is vital. But one issue is that only gets you so far. That gives you a lot of, kind of helps you rivet in certain places a little bit of like local reality. Then the question becomes, well, how can we, are we able to, generalize from these rivet points that we have in the global map to places beyond those? It's a bit better understand what the motivations are and what's causing people to move. So I do think there's a vital need for the rivets, as it were. We also need, more global data and understanding of or global or regional macro patterns, and somehow in combining, which generally do not, by the way, describe, what the motivations are or have limited ability to do that. I mean, to Ivana's point, we usually ask one or two questions about why people move. We rarely get beyond that, except in those kind of very contextualized local studies, again, those rivet points. So it's somehow being able to extrapolate a bit beyond the rivet points to understand what's going on at broader scales. Getting to the question about vulnerability, one of my areas of work is vulnerability mapping and using geospatial data in innovative ways to try to identify pockets of high susceptibility to climate hazards. And what I've been working with colleagues here, so we run a NASA data center. It's called the Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center, or CDAC for short. And we've been actually increasingly under the Biden administration tasked with looking at issues around environmental justice and climate justice. And so we've been both at the US level, but also more globally, trying to identify how do you best characterize populations using these proxies that we have through census data, survey data, and other things. We're about to release something called the Global Relative Deprivation Grid. It's a 1 kilometer grid globally. It's the first global effort. There's a relative wealth index that a group at Berkeley produced, which I think is fantastic and uses machine learning and a lot of other fancy approaches with remote sensing and other imagery to better understand, relative levels of wealth in different developing country contexts. What we did with the GRDI is basically look at the increasing availability of data from subnational human development indices. We have data on infant mortality rates at subnational levels. We also have data even at higher spatial specificity on the dependency ratio of populations. So in other words, the number of working age people in relation to those who are very young age groups or old age groups. And we also have data from satellite remote sensing on changes in nighttime lights and nighttime lights. And we've combined these together in a way that have tried to at least pinpoint where people are likely to be more susceptible to climate impacts. These things are always going to be proxies and never going to be perfect, but we are increasingly able to harness large amounts of data globally to be able to paint a picture of where people are potentially most susceptible to climate impacts. Over.
Thank you, Alex. I'll hand over to Ingrid.
Yeah, maybe to respond to that, I was almost putting it in the chat, but I thought it was actually this maybe an interesting type of debate. I guess most of the people probably online here are really with Alex and on the generalization and macro level sort of approaches. But I still wonder to what extent can we generalize and how far can we go in that, and how useful is that in the end? Also for making targeted adaptation policies that are also have to work locally and fit with the local context as well. I guess, but that's probably I come very much from this more qualitative type of sort of approach. But so that's maybe a question that pops in my mind. On which I guess some different perspectives are there, and maybe related to that, with the question. So this generally is focused on estimations. So I have these struggles myself and thinking about these things. And on the one hand, I understand that it's useful and that it could help to have more targeted policy making, and that we know also what's going on and what's happening. At the same time, I sometimes wonder for whom are we making the estimates, and what are the implications of these estimates and the numbers. Like if you then read the full reports, etc., you get the full context and the full sort of ideas behind it. But often the estimates are just the top estimate is sort of being circulated and does that, and in the end lead to the type of approach that we are sort of aiming for and hoping for. But maybe that's Alex likes to, I don't know, was a bit in relation to what you just said. So
yeah, I mean, so I'm guilty in a sense of coming up with global estimates of with the World Bank and through the groundswell reports of total numbers of climate migrants. I've actually repented of that and have more serious misgivings about the utility. I think what those estimates did do is get climate mobility on an agenda that wasn't necessarily, there before. And so it succeeded at some level in raising awareness of issues that at highest policy levels in many governments wasn't really being taken very seriously. So the numbers get bandied about, the 216 million. Of course, I always make clear that there's a lower band, which is around 40 million by 2050. And that's really this, maybe the size of a couple cities in the United States or something. But when you consider a global population of maybe approaching 10 billion at the time of 2050, it's really a very small number. And I've also, basically made clear in subsequent writing that I don't think we're ever going to be able to put a name, tag on people and say, I'm a climate migrant. It's just not going to happen that way. It's, these are people who are often fleeing very desperate situations in many parts of the world. I'm not, it's not across the board, obviously, but if you look at Central America, if you look at parts of West Africa and other regions where conflict and other things are starting to rise and grow in importance, then people are fleeing for security. And it becomes very challenging to identify people by one single, label. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. I'll hand over to Diogo.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe Ivana wants to go first, if you're complementing the information said by our colleagues, because otherwise I will change the perspective once again.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly complement what Ingrid was saying. So thank you so much for letting me speak first. Now, I think Ingrid made a very important point about not to generalize too much, because I think that's really important, and that's also the approach we are trying to take at IDMC, because many times we are approached by our partners, by different governments, they ask us for guidelines when it comes to measuring different types of displacements, what would be the recommended methodology, and so on. And actually, in many cases, we say we can give you some general guidance, but actually, every context is very specific when it comes to displacement and disasters. And you are actually the ones who knows best what it means, what is this tipping point for a person to get displaced. So I think, there can be some global guidelines and global recommendations on how to approach monitoring of slow onset disasters and displacement. However, each of them needs to be localized so that it corresponds to all the different contexts and also different livelihood zones. So we can see that in one country, we can still have very different thresholds for pastoralists to get displaced, for farmers to get displaced, for fishermen to get displaced. And we need to understand all these different nuances and have specific thresholds and specific data and information on each of these groups, even on the subnational level.
Okay, thank you, Ivana.
Go ahead, Diogo.
Yeah, so changing the perspective once again and bringing the national government approach from a few Latin American countries, and I will basically address the two last questions, the limitations in current disaster displacement data collection methodologies, and then what are the main available tools. And this is from another study conducted in 2019 and 20 in 6 different Latin American countries: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Mexico. And basically addressing what are the limitations in current data collection methodologies. When we check, this is the same actually in the Eastern Caribbean states. When we check disaster agencies, for instance, and how they work or how they collect data on disaster displacement, we notice that they usually have pre-established forms. So once you have, in the wake of a disaster, the disaster agency is activated and people are on the field capturing initially qualitative information and very broad information on the initial damages. And these forms are usually very similar. They do address structured damages and they capture some information on human damages. But then not always we see the human mobility dimension in these forms. What we see, for instance, are fields related to evacuated people, people in shelters, or homeless people, meaning that national governments usually do not acknowledge the category displacement, and thus we are not able to capture this information from official databases. This information is usually diluted in this broader category of affected people. So this was one point that I would like to raise. We see that national agencies, even though they are aware of the international agenda and recommendations, they not always adopt all these recommendations to have specific categories. So as Ivana was saying, we are not able to collect or have disaggregated data, for instance, and that's gonna hamper the development of policy responses in a second moment. The way data is collected, we are just, these countries are able to collect data on sudden onset events. So slow onset events remain somehow neglected under these national agencies. And yes, in terms of available tools, we also actually is not available. What is not available? These national agencies, they are mostly concerned with recovery measures. So they are gonna act post facto in the aftermath of a disaster, instead of having preventive actions and being able to work, for instance, on assessment reports in which we would be able to map risk areas and estimate the number of people that could possibly be displaced by a disaster. So that's it from my side. I hand over to you, Nando, and thanks again for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments, everyone, and discussion. We'll move on to the final set of questions. And as a key researcher in this field, what are your recommendations to overcoming existing challenges in the identification of environmental migrants, and to better prepare data collection methodologies that include them and produce timely and actionable data to address their specific needs? And just flagging, we have 26 minutes remaining, so if we want to have time for a Q&A to perhaps speed up, as these things usually happen, on the last set of questions. Anyone want to take this first? Diogo, I saw your hand first.
Yeah, maybe this time I can go first. So just a few recommendations on what I brought during the discussions. What would be the main recommendations to overcome existing challenges on data collection and methodologies, and again, bringing the approach to national government responses. One recommendation, for instance, it would be desirable to standardize all these forms used by national disaster agencies, for instance, in terms of gathering information related to disaster displacement. We do have the UN Statistical Commission with a few documents already on international migration statistics, internally displaced persons, statistics, and so on, and the respective expert groups providing some guidance in this regard. I would say that all these activities or attempt to collect data within national offices, they need to harmonize their methodology and design them with indicators on human mobility and migration data, disaggregated data, and information also brought by the Sendai framework, as well as the Agenda 2030. It would be very important, the adoption also of glossaries that would enable these national agencies to adopt the same definition. So in a very primary way, we would be able to compare the data they are gathering, emphasize the need of having population-based surveys, trying to capture all these nuances between slow and sudden onset events, the decision or not to move, and so on. So these would be my recommendations. I hand over to you, Ivana.
Thank you so much, Diego. So to build on what Diego said, I think I would conclude with 4 main recommendations. The first one would be to really try to define what are these critical thresholds or tipping points at which people get displaced, and to try to define that as much as we can on the local level for the different livelihood zones and different socioeconomic groups of populations and so on. So to really take the time for each of the countries where we are most concerned about the impact of onset disasters, and try to define these things so that we have some sort of a baseline of what we would consider as forced displacement, and then we can better measure it and monitor it. The second recommendation would be linked to what we discussed a bit at the beginning regarding the rigid data methodologies and data collections, and really first try to do more data collection on the household level, so it can really capture the different reasons why people move, their personal reasons, and offer multiple options in the questionnaires to be able to really say these 5 reasons contributed to why I or my family moved, and maybe even to highlight, and this was really the tipping point when I decided to move. That was the last thing which happened, and then I had to move. So to offer this in the questionnaires, and this would also allow to collect more disaggregated data, as Diogo was saying, if the questionnaires were more on the household level. Then the third recommendation would be, again, to conduct assessments on a more long-term basis. So again, not to start collecting data only when we see that a problem is happening, or problem, maybe it's not the right word, but basically when massive population movement is happening, but really to identify what would be the hotspots where we could observe in the future large population flows, and start monitoring them now, so that we can already see what are the more or less normal regular patterns, and then start identifying very early on when they become irregular, when people move with less livestock, or where people move in different directions than usual. So to start collecting the data as early as possible before mass displacement happens. And the last recommendation I would give would be also to use a bit better the current data sets, because there is already a lot of data available. But as I said, some of it's not cross-analyzed. So we have a lot of different data, but we don't look at it all together. We don't overlay the different data sets to understand better who would be more at risk, and who would be more at risk of displacement, and so on. The data sets are not interoperable. Even the data sets on displacement are not interoperable. So we have different agencies collecting data on the same areas in one country, but different indicators. But then we cannot analyze these 2 data sets together, just because the codes of locations, for example, are not used in the same way by the different agencies. So I would also encourage them to review the current data collection methodologies and try to align them so that we can already use better the available data. Thank you. And I think to Ingrid.
Yeah, thanks. Very useful points indeed. Indeed better using what we already have, taking a more long-term perspective, and yeah. And maybe to challenge also the debate a little, maybe in opposite or contrast to what Diogo was suggesting, I would rather wonder to what extent we should harmonize the categories, the indicators, etc., and rather maybe move to a more locally informed understanding of what's going on, and doing that, so also better involve the actual groups or populations that are at risk in defining as to how they see the risk and their mobility or their climate futures, and to better engage with that, also to be able to become the action to make them more and more targeted. Just an example of that is so reading from Bordner and others on the Marshall Islands, showing how sort of this global imaginary of the small island states being lost to the sea, and that there's sort of no other way out, and that in the end everybody would need to relocate, sort of makes it more difficult for the government to get adaptation funds to adapt locally, etc. So it goes sort of against maybe some of the wishes that they are there locally because of sort of this sort of global sort of narratives that are there. And therefore, I think it's good to see more as to how people can define their own sort of climate futures, and as what that means for data in comparison. I find it interesting that in urban geography there's from I don't know her first name, but Robinson is her last name, and she talks about a comparative approach to think a bit less rigidly about really hardcore comparison, but think that a bit more in looser terms, and therefore you can have differences in categories and in frames, but still look into sort of emergent features or similarities or differences in that. But maybe that's nice to explore and look look into. And then Alex, maybe, I don't know if you don't have your hands up, no?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interventions and comments on that. We've had several questions coming through in the chat, so we'll make use of the last 15 minutes or so to go through those. I'll ask them in batches of 3, and then please raise a hand and address whichever of the questions you would prefer to address. The panelists can see all of the questions. Some of the questions were directed specifically to the panelists, so I'll read them out for the benefit of attendees. First question I have that I can see is, why not shift the huge and, so from Leslie, huge and very problematic focus on counting those displaced or moving to one much more diligently centered on tracking physical or social environments that are most at risk, most likely to push people from their homes. Second question is from Lorenzo. Thank you all for the discussion. The question relates to the notion of indicators. We've heard a lot about data elements that can help identify causation of movements and quantify environmental movements, and how to identify thresholds to recognize forced movements. But given how context specific these patterns are and how different the meaning of moving can be, life-saving adaptation, distress, last resort, what does the occurrence of movements mean or actually indicate? And can we use it as an indicator of vulnerability, risk, impacts, and if so, under when and how? Thanks in advance for the feedback. And the third question from Sonali is, thank you for the discussion. I think everyone can see this question. I'd like to know if the comments made on data needs and limitations would apply to both international migration and internal displacement, or if you would highlight specific considerations for each. Over. Alex, please go ahead. And please also maybe say which you're addressing.
Yeah, they're all great questions. And so I think I'll try Leslie's. Hi, Leslie. It's, you know, one of the things we wrote, colleagues and I, in a paper for Science last year, it was for a special issue on managed retreat, was this kind of, there've been in recent years an increasing number of articles that use global kind of top-down modeling to identify places that essentially may approach thresholds of habitability. It's a term that we used advisedly in the article and had a specific definition of what habitability means. And I'll put a link to it after, and if people want to contact me, if they don't have access to the paywall at Science, I'll be happy to send it to them. But I think that this gets a little bit to this question. So we sort of juxtapose the top down with the bottom up, and emphasize very much that the top down can be useful, even though sometimes it's misused, and can be used in ways that Ingrid described earlier, of pulling the plug on adaptation efforts in regions that might be considered to be, triaged by international development organizations or others who say, well, what's the point? Why should we continue to invest in these spaces? So I think while there is, continued some utility in identifying these so-called hotspots that should not be used in that way at all, but rather combined with really contextual data collection to better understand context in which displacement might occur, but also, as Ingrid's written quite a bit about involuntary immobility and this question of people not being able to move at all, and what might be considered a progressive immiseration or impoverishment that results in people essentially lacking options. And I think we have to look at both sides, the mobility and the immobility side of the coin, and understand what might happen in those contexts where conditions are not improving. I'll stop there, but I think it's an important question of tracking some of the environments where these sorts of things are likely to happen, and I think it also gets in part to Lorenzo's question. Over.
Yes, Ingrid, go ahead, please.
Yeah, maybe I can take the one on the internal and international one, say a few things on that. I think yeah, a lot of research has, I think, shown that most of the mobility are taking place on a somewhat more local level, but still, I think that there are also cross-border, especially on a regional level, cross-border patterns, and I think that also very much requires a rich historical also insight of these dynamics. But therefore, yeah, it's not something we can maybe debate on now, but maybe it's something that I wondered about indeed, if you monitor and trace these type of movements across border, then I guess at some point you will also have to think more about these ethical dimensions. To what extent can you trace people and these types of flows, and if it could also, yeah, harm them, especially when sort of borders are sort of involved. It just maybe a question that got my mind in relation to what Ivana also first earlier said. So I guess that's something that the political sensitivities of particular data, I guess, become somewhat more important for dimensions of international migration. There's maybe some things that pop my mind.
Thank you, Ingrid. And we'll hand over to Ivana.
Thank you. And so I guess I can try to address the question from Lorenzo, which I think is the last one remaining. So it's a very interesting question. And, I would say that these actual movements, what they indicate, yes, from one side, they can indicate, vulnerabilities, and that, these people who are moving are actually fleeing a very critical situation. They are in need of immediate humanitarian assistance and support. But at the same time, it can also mean, strength, and we shouldn't view these people as victims. In any case, these people can move even before they reach this critical threshold. They move in order to prevent the effects of climate change or any sort of disaster which might occur, and they can be moving usually to urban areas, but also different places in order to be engaged in different sort of livelihoods or employment, and they might need a very different type of support compared to the people who are already fleeing a humanitarian emergency created by drought, for example. And it's very important to sort of understand why these people are fleeing and at which stage of the cycle they are, if they are fleeing a humanitarian emergency or if they are fleeing a situation which has not reached this critical threshold yet, but they want to flee preventively. And then we need to be prepared in the areas of their destination to be able to respond to their needs and adapt also adapt the response in urban centers, prepare the urban planning for their arrival, to ensure that once they arrive to the urban areas, they will be able to settle in places which are safe from the sort of safety point of view, but also safe that they are not at risk of disasters, which happens very often, that people who flee, the only place they find it's in areas near rivers or areas which are prone to disasters. They build informal settlements there, and then when a storm comes, they get displaced again. So we need to understand that and be prepared in the areas of destination to welcome them and adapt all the planning accordingly.
Thank you, Ivana. Any more comments on those first three questions? Okay, I can see one question I missed from earlier, but or perhaps we addressed it enough during the discussion, but from Sushmita on how to measure long-term climate change or slow onset events-related migration. If any of you would like to say more on that, you can. And then we have a question from Ranjan on the challenge that local governments are yet to, and national governments are yet to recognize terminology of climate migrants or IDPs, and what your suggestions to bringing in policy changes in that regard would be.
Maybe I can address this very last question. Well, we still have a huge debate regarding methodology, terminologies, right? How should we, my background is in law, so I'm always involved in this kind of discussions. Should we address them as refugees or migrants, displaced people, and so on? And of course, together with, I would say that the lack of a well-established terminology, and then I would just like to highlight the Task Force on Displacement from UNFCCC and the recommendation to use the broad umbrella terminology that is human mobility, that would encompass migration, displacement, and planned relocation. Also giving attention to immobility or threat populations, so that we can keep all the particularities and specificities from each sort of movement. So hopefully this terminological debate shall not be the focus anymore, and that would enable us to work on policies. And I would say that the terminology aspect, together with better understanding the multi-causality of all factors leading to the decision to move or force movement, as well as what we are debating today, methodologies to better quantify people who are moving because of environmental or climatic disasters. They all hamper the development of policies or legal responses, either at the local or state level, you know. So the challenges remain, and maybe the solution is instead of having the global, the top-down approach from globally to locally, having and considering measures or adaptation measures, strategies that are adopted locally, and as Ingrid was saying, and respect the way they are coping with climate stressors, right? So I think that was it. I hand over to you, Nando.
Thank you very much, Diogo, and that we've managed to get all four panelists each answering a question. That's worked out quite nicely. I'll hand over quickly to Sylvain, who has a contribution as well.
Thank you, Nando, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the rich conversation we had this afternoon. I wanted just to highlight the message that I just sent on the chat, getting the work that IOM and IDMC are doing on getting these indicators linked to the disaster risk reduction. As you may know, the global platform on disaster risk reduction just ended in Bali a few days ago. And IOM and IDMC decided to do like a stock take regarding the different metrics and indicators that are on the present on different agencies, UN agency, but also different government monitoring displacement. And as you may know, also the Sendai framework doesn't have any indicators related to specific displacement. This is why IOM and IDMC decided to see how we can propose like what we call custom indicators that government could maybe pilot in the first phase. This is why over the last few months, we did, with the support of Lorenzo, the state of the art to see what are the different approaches that are happening in different countries, but also in different agencies. And from that, we develop a set of metrics, and the metrics are also well known by you because it's the different flow and the number of IDPs that are living in station with displacement. And from these different metrics, we are also proposing a set of indicators, like what are the ratio of mortality versus the people displaced, that we can see how it moves over time. Just to give you like the state of the art will be published on the website that I just shared with you in the coming days. And we will share in the smaller group, the one that are on the web page again, the set of indicators that we are proposing just to see how it will be received by by you guys. And later it will be a pilot by different countries over the next semester. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain, and thank you again to all the panelists. I will just share my screen to highlight the next session that we will be having. And sorry, 1 second, we'll get hopefully you can all see the right screen. But just firstly to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, and I think we had a very nice discussion that walked through the importance of holistic information and not looking just at the symptom, but really looking at the whole range of interconnected factors that play into vulnerability, play into decision-making, play into the ability to move or not. And that we had panelists who could come at this from very different angles, from the National Statistical Office level, from the localized level, and that, for example, where we do want to combine tools at the higher level, it's important that we can then have that comparability, but then of course not to lose the specificity and the knowledge that we have in local scenarios and local cases, and that we need to always marry those approaches where we can. And we discussed a huge amount of other things, but I'm conscious that we're now almost finished, so we'll turn to just highlighting the next webinar in the D webinar series. Session 3 on disaster displacement as loss and damage is loosely scheduled for 23rd of June with the time TBC, but that date could change by a day or two. So keep posted for that. And thank you very much for joining. Thank you to our panelists. And thank you to those of you also contributed with questions to the discussion. I hope you found it useful.